station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This is the Cities podcast and I'm your host, Stephen Bauman. Now recently we just finished a Cities series featuring Havana, Cuba, in which I chose 20 objects in order to describe the history of the city of Havana. I'm embarking now on a much more difficult task, one where I try to go city by city for each of the 10 host cities for World Cup 2018. Now, if you listen to my series on Havana, and I encourage you to go back and check it out, you will have known that it is an enormous struggle, even for a city with only 500 years of history, to choose 20 objects to represent it for historical significance. Now, this is an even greater challenge because through this 10-part series, I'm just going to sometimes do multiple cities in a day. I'm going to look at different cities in the Russia World Cup. So with that said, I won't possibly be able to tell you everything about Moscow or other cities that host events like St. Petersburg, but I'm going to give you as much information as I can and hopefully have you understand a little more about the city and about its significance before you watch these matches in the spring and summer of 2018. So our first city is Moscow. Moscow is a city that just the name sort of triggers these emotions in people and conjures up images of Russia for most people. You think about Moscow whenever Russia's mentioned in a sort of news release, it's the representation of Russia because it's the seat of the Russian government. So let's start. What is Moscow? There's over 12 million people in the city, 17 million within the whole metropolis area. So Moscow is an absolutely massive European city. It's also one of the coldest and one of the northernmost massive cities on Earth. So Moscow is quite far north. It's also quite far east of Europe, but it's still part of this European Russia, and it's the capital of Russia, as it has been since the 1917, since the Soviet Union was established. So Moscow's this massive city. It's in the north. It's the center. It's the capital of Russia. It's also known by a number of different names. It's called the Third Rome, the First Throne, various names that describe its sort of greatness to the world. And that's the theme of Moscow, and that's why the opening ceremonies of this World Cup are going to be held in Moscow. Now, one of the things I like to look at, as you well know if you listen to these series, are flags, because flags tell us a story about sort of how the government wants the city to be represented. And Russian cities have excellent flags. They have excellent coats of arms. So we're going to be using those throughout this series. And the Russian flag that for Moscow is simple in design, and it's easy to understand, and it gives us a lot of information about the city. On it is St. George. Now, you might know St. George's Cross is the representation on the flag of England. St. George is this commonly evoked trope in iconography. What it is the saint riding a white horse slaying a dragon. So that should give you an image of what St. George is, and that's what it is. That's the flag of Moscow. The shield is St. George, and there's a lot of reasons for St. George, and a lot of historians have described sort of the symbolism of slaying this dragon, and it can represent challenges. It's the classic hero story, St. George saving the civilization, sort of killing the dragon. Now, the reason St. George was chosen was because some of the first founders, as was tradition, when Moscow was founded in the 12th century, sort of the representative or the patron saint of the founder of the city would usually put his patron saint on the flag or on the shield, and that was the case for St. George. So dating back to the 12th century, Moscow was an important city. And the idea of establishing Moscow as a third Rome. So the first Rome is Rome. It's the seat of the Catholic Church where the Pope is. The second Rome was Constantinople, or the seat of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we know more commonly as the Byzantine Empire, also the seat of the Orthodox Church. And then the third Rome was going to be Moscow after the Byzantine Empire falls and Constantinople turns to Istanbul. Moscow says, we are now the third Rome, and we're going to be the seat of Christianity. And this becomes important for a long time, and it remains the seat of the Russian Orthodox Church as it is today. So St. George is a symbol. Now, if you're going to Moscow and you're going to these games, you're not going to see a lot of statues of St. George, because St. George was, statues were actually banned from the Russian Orthodox Church as sort of this, you can't represent saints in human form. You're not going to do them justice. So statues were not allowed in the Russian Orthodox Church for a long time. After the fall of the Soviet Union, actually, though, when the Russian Orthodox Church is brought back, statues are re-allowed. And so now there are various statues, but all of these come from the 1990s. So if you see a statue of St. George, it's appealing to this 12th century founding of Moscow and its result of this resurgence of the Russian Orthodox faith. Interesting to note, one of the famous sculptors of these St. George statues also sculpted a St. George statue out of discarded missiles that sits in front of the United Nations in New York City. So if you're in New York and you want to go see a representation of the patron saint of Moscow, then you can certainly see that done by a Russian sculptor, and a symbol of friendship between the United States and Russia, something that we would certainly like to see happen in this tense moment in our current affairs. So what happened to Moscow? Well, from the 12th century through the rest, it's been attacked repeatedly by rival empires, rival armies. A lot of people wanted this city. It became a walled city as early as the 12th century and built around the Moskva River. So big cities are typically built around rivers, and once these sort of medieval towns were built, walls were built around the cities to keep the invaders outside. Now, if you know anything about history, walls work great sometimes, but a lot of times they don't when you invent technology to destroy the wall, and the Mongols did just that. 13th century, the Mongols sort of burned Moscow down and killed basically everyone who doesn't run away. And it's not until the late 13th century that people sort of rebuild Moscow. And so there's this constant back and forth between the Mongol hordes, the Tartars, the Russian Orthodox, who are still Eastern Orthodox Christianity at this time. Numerous Khans invade. There's an enormous amount of cultural diffusion, changes in sort of cultural sharing, acculturation. Moscow becomes this sort of meeting point of all these Central Asian cultures and Eastern European cultures. So it's quite an interesting city for much of the medieval era, moving on forward. Now, Moscow also faces a lot of plagues, a lot of famines, a lot of unrest. It's not until the 18th century, though, that Moscow sort of loses a bit of significance when Peter the Great unifies Russia and moves the capital to St. Petersburg. Now, the capital stays there up until 1918, after the Soviet Revolution, which largely takes place in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but Moscow is made the capital of the Soviet Union again, sort of the Soviets getting out of World War I and changing the focus of Russia. So from 1918 on, Moscow is of enormous global significance. In World War II, Hitler attempts to attack and invade Moscow like Napoleon tried in the 18th century and failed, 19th century and failed. Hitler fails as well. So Moscow also has this sort of great history of turning away invaders. No one's ever able to conquer Moscow. And from World War II, it's enormously significant part of the Soviet Union. It's enormously significant part of the international dialogue, and it grows into one of the great cities of the world. So today, it still sits along the Moskva River. In the winter, this river is frozen, as I mentioned, because it's a freezing cold city. But in the summer, it's rather pleasant with the temperatures in the 70 degrees. So Moscow has this sort of very harsh winters, but very, very nice summers. And so that will certainly be on showcase in the World Cup. Now, Moscow is the center of Russian culture. It is the cultural as well as political capital of Russia. It has fabulous museums, from the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts to the Great War Memorial Museum, the State Historical Museum, Red Square itself. Museums notwithstanding, Red Square itself with St. Basil's Cathedral, Lenin's Mausoleum, is just a fantastic place to be. The Kremlin, the center of the Russian government, and Red Square, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So there's a lot to see in Moscow, not to mention the beautiful sort of historical buildings that line the streets outside of Red Square and beyond the Kremlin. And a lot of people know this because Moscow was the host of the 1980 Olympics. The USA boycotted those Olympics. In a lot of ways, the US are boycotting these World Cup by failing to qualify. No, there was no boycott of this World Cup, not by any nations yet. Some royals in Britain have said they're not going to go, but the United States failed to qualify. Some other big nations failed to qualify, but that's not going to take away from the action that's in Moscow. So Moscow actually has two different stadiums for this event. They have Luzhniki Stadium and Spartak Stadium. The opening game on the 14th of June is going to feature Russia versus the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is sort of interesting, kind of added geopolitical significance considering what's going on in Syria right now with Russia and Iran kind of supporting the current regime and Saudi Arabia taking the other side there. There's going to be some other really excellent games in Moscow. Germany versus Mexico on the 17th. Denmark and France, Poland and Senegal. So Moscow will see its fair share of action. The final on 15th of July is also going to be played in Luzhniki Stadium, the same stadium that hosted the 1980 Olympic Games. So what is the significance of Moscow? I think I've made it pretty clear. It's a center of culture, and it's certainly going to be the center of this grand movement to Russia to watch the World Cup. A lot of people are going to start in Moscow, whether they're connecting to smaller cities. It is the Russian hub. It has the major airports of the current Russian Federation. And it's going to have some damn good football matches. So I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction of Moscow. I will certainly have to revisit the city as I take you through some of the other host cities of World Cup 2018. Political questions aside and political debates aside, it is shaping up to be a fantastic World Cup. And editorial note, as someone who has been to Moscow, and I was fortunate enough to go to Moscow in the winter, I ice skated in Red Square, I visited Lenin's Mausoleum, visited St. Basil's Cathedral. Moscow is one of, if not the most beautiful city in the world. So if you're lucky enough to go see it, enjoy, and if not, enjoy those big images they show you in the halftime and pregame shows. Thanks for listening. This is Hour of History, Cities Podcast, World Cup Edition.